Hello everyone, so welcome back to US history. Today our topic is going to be the Progressive Era. So we're looking at a time period in history where a lot of changes had happened to the country in a relatively small amount of time, and more or less the country decided through the government and through society that something had to be done to address many of those issues that had developed about over the previous 50 years. So let's look at what they did. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about is who were the people that were behind all these ideas about trying to address these issues brought about by capitalism, industrialization, and urbanization. So in our studies, these are the things that we have been looking at for the first part of this unit. After the Civil War, there was a lot of change. The economy was really strong at moments. It had some dips at times. But because there were changes in how things were made, what goods were being used, where people were living, that created a brand new United States, almost a modern United States as we think of it. And what that meant is there were a lot of growing pains. So what happened is some issues that we're going to look at in a little bit. Here are the people that were behind the movement in order to try and address these issues. Some of these people were involved within the government, and we had three main presidents that were very much supportive of addressing the issues that were brought along by the expansion of capitalism, our new industries, and movement into cities, industrialization. The first of these presidents was Theodore Roosevelt, sort of still decided in a modern way as one of sort of the best presidents we've had. He's on Mount Rushmore. You might recognize him from there. He's the one on the pictures on your screen on the top left. So he served from 8 years, 1901 to 1909. The reason he fits into the progressive movement is because he is the first president that really supported these reforms. If you look at the Republican Party or the Democratic Party before this, both of them were just kind of going along with all these industrial changes. They saw it as supporting the economy, so they said, you know what, we're going to kind of let this happen. It had never before happened where the government got extremely involved in regulating the economy or telling large corporations what they could and could not do. By the time we get to around the year 1900, there are significant changes and the government starts to interfere with these reforms. You'll see what some of these reforms are later on. Something specific about him is we could consider him a pro-union president because he thought that that could help to lead to better working conditions. So there's one kind of interesting story that goes with this, and this was that there was a strike in the anthracite mine. So anthracite is an ore you get out of the ground, and you can get all these new industrial resources out of that ore. And what was happening is the miners involved there were trying to unionize. So they're trying to create a group so that they could negotiate with the business owners to try and get higher wages, better working conditions, better hours. But because people had no rights in the workplace, they really couldn't do it. But what would happen is that if we weren't getting all these goods out of the ground for resources, it would interfere with the economy. So what Theodore Roosevelt did is he called in the leaders of this union that was trying to form and the leaders of the business that refused to negotiate, and pretty much locked them in a room together and said, here's what we're going to do. You're going to negotiate, you're going to make a compromise, or my government is going to step in, take over the mines, and have the military work them instead. That was something neither group wanted. The business owner said, well, then I won't own this property anymore, so it'll take away my property, and the workers would lose their jobs in the process. So guess what happened? The two groups worked together through the initiative of the government. And that's what you need to remember about this progressive movement is that it's one thing for people to want to change things, to reform things. It's another thing for the government to help those happen. And really, you need the government's assistance in order to actually make them effective because it's through the laws and through those actions that things can really get going. The president after Theodore Roosevelt, his name was William Howard Taft. He's not as remembered as Theodore Roosevelt is for being involved in the progressive movement. So he more or less continued Teddy Roosevelt's take on big business to start to break up some companies and to give them some regulations to make sure that they weren't overusing resources and being a bit more responsible about it. He's less remembered for his progressive reforms. He's more remembered for being our biggest president. So you can see him on the top right there. There's a story about him getting stuck in a bathtub that's probably a myth, but possibly true. Ask me about that in class if you're interested. Just know with Taft, he continued Roosevelt's ideas, which meant that for 4 more years after Roosevelt, the progressive movement continued to have support within the government. Now, both Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans. Who came after them was a Democrat who served for 8 years after that. But the progressive movement was not just a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. What was going on is that all these issues and problems were so pervasive and all across the country and all across everything you could think of that both parties agreed that changes had to be made. So what that meant is Wilson continued to follow these same progressive policies even though he was from a different political party. And I know in a modern sense it seems impossible that the two political parties could really agree about something and work together and not against each other on something. But that is one reason the progressive movement was successful, is because it was not stuck to one party or the other. Really many groups within the government were willing to support it. He extended the government's role in regulating business, so there were some things from before that made it possible for the government to regulate business, but he and the Congress that was in power when he was in power worked to create new laws that defined exactly how they were allowed to regulate those businesses, so that it was much more specific in the process. All right, so that's one group of progressives. The other group of progressives were called muckrakers, which sounds almost like a derogatory word. It's not, but I'll tell you who they were and tell you what that term means. Muckrakers were investigative journalists who exposed the problems brought on by industrialization. So think of it this way. Muck is like something really like disgusting and gross, right? So think like dirt or sludge or something like that. There's even that one Pokemon whose name is Muck, M-U-K, and what does he look like? A blob of disgusting muck and gross things, right? Similar word. When you rake something, it's like when you're raking leaves, you're bringing it in. So what those muckrakers did is they looked around the United States, they looked into government, into business practices, all these different things, and they found all these really gross things going on, and they raked it all in, collected it, and then showed it to the public to say, hey, public, bet you didn't know this was going into your meat. Bet you didn't know this is how Rockefeller was able to make so much money. So they brought everything in, did a lot of extensive reporting, and then exposed it to the public, who was outraged and pressured the government, those presidents before, to actually do something about it. Two significant muckrakers. One, her name is Ida Tarbell, so she's that lady on the bottom left. So she was a reporter that did a lot of investigating of the Standard Oil Trust. So that was that company operated by John D. Rockefeller that we studied at the beginning of our unit. And we looked at how we used horizontal integration in order to build up that company and control the industry. What she did is she researched his business practices, some of them that were on pretty questionable ground. Remember, the trust was that idea of basically taking the whole business and setting prices so they could make prices higher when really they weren't competing with each other. So she helped to discover that. She helped to show that to the public and say, who's really in charge here? Capitalism works when people compete, but Rockefeller's preventing competition from happening, and the government's not doing anything about it. So her expose there helped to get the ball rolling on regulating big business. One that we're going to look at in class, which is absolutely disgusting, is a guy named Upton Sinclair that investigated the meatpacking industry. So again, we'll read about this in class, but when you look at what conditions were like within places where they processed food, it was unregulated and absolutely horrible and disgusting. I'm going to leave those actually, like literally juicy details for what we do in class. So look forward to that gross stuff. All right, so those were the progressive reformers, but we also want to know what types of reforms were these people getting done from the government, from within, and the muckrakers putting pressure on the government to get it done from without. So one place that they tried to reform was what happened in the workplace. So, sorry, this thing's not quite working. Whoop. Industrial working conditions were really horrible in this era. So if you were working in a factory, you had absolutely no rights. So you could be fired for whatever reason. There were no safety standards, no health standards. And what that meant is that you worked in a place that was probably unsafe and unsanitary. But if you made a stink about it or complained, what would happen? Well, you had no workplace rights, so you'd just be fired. But something happened in 1911, sort of towards the middle to the end of the progressive movement, that really revealed why this was such a problem. And this is called, if it'll show up, sorry guys, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. All right. So what happened is that building that you see on the right there was right in the middle of Manhattan in New York City. And the top 3 floors of that building had a factory in it in which mostly women worked to sew pieces of fabric. So remember that sweatshop picture we saw from Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives? It's sort of like that. They were doing the same work 12, 14 hours a day, cutting fabric. They had piles of sort of fabric they were throwing away. Remember, like those rag pickers would pick up? And within there, they're doing all this, working super busy. Remember, there were no health or safety standards, so people were smoking on the job, really not paying attention to what was happening. So what happened is there was some oily rags or some fabric or some cigarette butts or something, and a fire started on the top of that building. But as has been up there on the screen for a little bit, is people didn't have workplace rights, and the owners of the company were afraid that these women were going to steal what they were making, so they locked them inside while they were working and inspected their bags whenever they came in and left. So what that meant is when the fire happened, the bosses weren't actually in the room, they were on another floor, and the workers were stuck in there, and many of them burned to death. Now, another issue. There were fire departments, but there weren't a lot of skyscrapers. So they only had fire truck ladders that could reach about 6 floors up, like a tenement building. But this building was taller, and what that meant is that the ladders couldn't go high enough to rescue the women that were there. So eventually 146 people died, mostly women, and they were either burned alive or they jumped to their death. So when they finally got in there after the fire was put out, they saw heaps of burnt bodies by all the exits. Remember, they were locked in there. Or there was starting to be piles of bodies of women that jumped rather than burning to death on the sidewalk below. So some of them even jumped onto like sewer grates, and it shredded their body as they hit those grates. So what happened is right in the middle of New York City, the biggest city in America, there was this very visible industrial accident that showed all the problems associated with unregulated industry. Remember as well, unions weren't really a thing. People didn't have rights. So after the fact, there was a lawsuit against the owners of the company that said, well, should you get in trouble for having locked your workers in and having the doors not open out, but open in, so there was no way for them to bash down the door to get out? And the court said, well, since there weren't any laws to say it was illegal for them to do that, then it wasn't a problem. What happened, though, is this major incident inspired many progressives within New York State and city to create the first safety laws. One of them is that doors have to open out. So if you ever, we can look in the classroom, the door opens out and there's an exit sign there. Why? Because the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire started this movement to have safety laws over 100 years ago. All right, so one thing to reform was make the workplace safer. Another place where there needed to be some safety was in what we were eating, what we were consuming. Okay, so before this era, really no regulation of what companies could put into food and other goods. So no regulation, so they could kind of get away with stuff. And you might have even been looking at the bottom right this whole time and saying, why does he have a picture that says cocaine toothache drops? Because that was a real thing. What happened is there wasn't modern medicine. So remember, with most of the medicine we have, it doesn't actually treat the illness, it treats the symptoms. And if we go all the way back to these toothache drops, the idea is that you've got a sore tooth, right? It might be because there's an infection budding, whatever's going on. But there wasn't a medicine to actually get rid of the infection yet. However, there was cocaine, which is going to numb any pain that was coming from the toothache before you got the tooth removed. I don't even want to think about how they removed teeth back then, because there was no anesthetic and what's the word? The thing to kind of like make you numb. This would make it numb for the time being with the cocaine, but not in the long run. But on the other hand, there's cocaine in medicine. Most medicine back then was just actually alcohol with a little bit of other stuff in there, right? What does that tell you? It's about numbing the pain, not fixing the issue. What happened, though, is the government started to pass some laws that said, you know what? the things that companies are selling to people to consume, to eat, and to use really need to be a bit safer. One was the Meat Inspection Act, which we're going to look at in class. Again, Upton Sinclair's Jungle showed how disgusting the meatpacking industry was. This was the law made in response to say that food had to be clean, like verified that it doesn't have rat poop and stuff in it when you're selling it to the public. Another one was the Pure Food and Drug Act, same year, which meant that the labeling had to be correct. So if it says cocaine on there, then they can't tell you, they can't not tell you, I should say, what the side effects are going to be. There's some other stuff. There were sort of these, again, like drops you took to improve your complexion, to get rid of acne or whatnot. But it had arsenic in it, which is a deadly heavy metal that poisons you over time. So that law says it has to be safe. It has to be labeled if there's any dangers. Same thing like if you watch TV and there's all these ads for prescription medicine and they have all the fine print that says what the side effects are and they have to say them out loud as well. That's because of things like the Pure Food and Drug Act. We take these things for granted that the things we eat should be safe to eat, but back then, because there weren't any laws, there wasn't any way that you could sort of get people in trouble, get companies in trouble, sue them for what they do. So think like, today when there's like E. coli breakouts in different food processing plants. We know about that because there are laws that say that has to be revealed to the public. Back then, people just assumed it was your fault that you were getting sick. So protecting the people, and the government is making those laws to protect those people. All right. A couple of other types of reforms. One was about regulating big business. So when we're talking big business, we're talking about companies owned by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, JP Morgan, all these guys that were those, take your pick, captains of industry or robber barons. They had so much power that they could start to manipulate the government. But now the government is going to start to be able to take action in order to stop that. So the very first act to regulate business was all the way before the progressive movement in 1890. It was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. What it did is it made illegal for large companies to create those trusts, which meant that they were kind of colluding with each other, doing business and setting prices when really they should have been competing with each other. Now, the problem with this law is it said that the government could do it, but it didn't define what a trust was or how large the company had to be. Much later on, Woodrow Wilson and Congress would create something called the Clayton Antitrust Act that created all these definitions that could actually make it happen. But that wasn't until the 1910s. So for about 20 years, there was some regulation possible, but it never happened. Actually, usually it went after unions instead because they claimed that unions, people coming together to fight for more rights in the workplace and better pay, were actually preventing business from happening. So it actually had the opposite effect for a while and was eventually fixed by the progressive movement with Woodrow Wilson. Along these same lines, Theodore Roosevelt was known as the Trust Buster. So nice because it rhymes, right? But he was one that actually came in and actually used the government to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up some of these big companies. The one he's famous for breaking up is the Standard Oil Trust. So too much power in one company with horizontal integration. He said, you've got all these companies that are in one, you need to break up into different regional companies that then compete with each other. All right, so notice the government is taking action to make this happen. There's other regulations going on. More trusts were broken up over time, but it's through this movement and through government action and actual enforcement of the laws that we can actually see reform happening. Now, the last thing about progressivism, the last thing we're talking about here, sort of the dark side of it, right? And there's a side that it sounds like all this is good. It said, here's a problem in society. Let's use some government power to improve social conditions that really had gotten lax in the expansion of the economy. But to improve social conditions, some people, most of the progressives, had some ideas that today we would call racist when we actually look at them saying, how do we want to fix society? One of these ideas is called social Darwinism, and it's essentially applying Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to society. So that's the idea of the survival of the fittest. So in nature, that means that when there's certain species that have, something going on that makes it easier for them to survive, they're more likely to survive through thousands and thousands of years of the ones more likely to survive breeding with each other and creating ones with stronger immune systems, or all these different things that make them more likely to survive. The ones that didn't died off and they're gone, and their traits are gone as well. What happened with social Darwinism is something that Charles Darwin completely disagreed with. And that was the concept that we could do this to human society as well, and say that the people that were naturally strong became rich, the people that were naturally poor or naturally weak became poor. And what this could be used to could be to justify why the poor were poor and why the rich were rich, and why nothing had to be done in order to try and change this inequality of wealth. Those same people were saying we got to use the government to make sure businesses don't abuse their power, but individuals with wealth, they weren't really concerned about that. Okay, so social Darwinism, it happened back in Europe as well. The ideas actually started there and then came over to the United States. Now, the progression of social Darwinism actually took the form in some laws that were made only at the state level, but this is a movement called eugenics. And this was basically pseudoscience, so fake science, where people used what they thought about science to justify, again, why the rich were better than the poor, but eventually why whites were better than blacks as well. Before this, we studied the Jim Crow era, and this is the exact same time period where laws were made to basically subjugate black people and make them second-class citizens, and then science was used on top of that to justify why it was okay. The goal eventually of this would be to legally sterilize inferior people. So that could be the working class, anyone with sort of like a mental disability, even black people, people that were going to jail as well, that were convicted of crimes. Many states had laws that once you were in prison, the government could sterilize you, so make it impossible for you to create more people through reproduction. So again, that actually happened. Those laws eventually went away, but they existed in the same era where a lot of progress was being made to fix the problems of society. But you can see with these that another element of that was saying, we think black people and poor people are a problem with society, so how can we use the laws in order to get rid of them or to make them not have as big of a role in society? So again, for every side of that there's something good, there is something a little bit bad as well, and that's even true with progressivism. All right, folks, thank you so much for watching. So we'll go over this a little bit in class as well, just to set up a general timeline of what happened to lead to this and what came out of it. And then we'll be able to go a little bit more into depth in this with some primary sources and seeing with what more of these reforms were as well. All right, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.